listener production.
Hey, it's Chris Spyrou here.
And Tara Cassidy.
Welcome to The Briefing. And in case you missed it, ladies and gentlemen, the federal budget has been handed down.
This budget is our plan for a new generation of prosperity in a new world of uncertainty.
Hear, hear. Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivering his fourth and possibly last budget last night, offering up some quote-unquote great news for anyone out there who's got to pay tax, power bills and for medicine, while also revealing which illegal industry is punching a pretty big hole in the government's bottom line.
And after posting two back-to-back surpluses, the Treasurer's delivered a deficit that he's expecting we're going to be in for the next 10 years. The coffer's now $26.9 billion in the red. In this morning's budget-only episode, we're breaking down what you need to know about Labor's economic plan for you over the next 4 years and more. And we know the devil is in the detail, so while the government would love to have us thinking everyone's a winner after last night, let's find out if that's really the case.
The cost of living is front of mind for most Australians, and it is front and centre in this budget.
Now, the budget is often referred to as a journo's or political nerds' Christmas, Tara, with the Treasurer being Santa Claus, of course. Some of our stockings are no doubt filled with presents, others with coal. Tara, start us off with the apparent good stuff. And one of the very few surprises from last night, tax cuts.
Yeah, that's right. So this was just about the only announcement that the government did keep close to its chest, a tax cut for everyone. Jim Chalmers calling it modest but meaningful.
Every Australian taxpayer will get a tax cut next year and the year after to top up the tax cuts which began in July.
Yeah. So he's promised to reduce the lowest tax rate from 16% to 15% from mid-next year and then 14% in 2027. So that'll be a cost of about $17.1 billion over the next 5 years. And this is, of course, if the Labor government is voted back in.
In order to give a tax cut for every Australian taxpayer, the benefits are felt disproportionately to people we are encouraging into work, younger workers, women, people on lower and middle incomes. They will proportionately be the biggest beneficiaries of these topped-up tax cuts.
Now, this will be in a staggered approach. So next year, this will work out to be about $268 back in the pocket of the average income earner who's sitting on around $79K a year. And then that'll jump to $536 in 2027. But in terms of what that actually looks like off your weekly budget, well, you'll be getting about $5 a week next year and then $10 a week in 2027. Woo! With some people now humorously calling it the $5 budget, Chris.
Yeah, and that's what's been attracting the most criticism so far. It's the value of a cup of coffee or a 3-litre bottle of milk. Look, I guess we'll take what we can get, but I do say that as someone who doesn't hold a mortgage like millions of people across this country, the average monthly repayment sitting around $3,000 to $5,000, nor have I copped a rental increase in the last 12 months. So the median rent now sitting around $600 a week. I don't know exactly how this $5 to $10 is going to, make a dent. Obviously, there are caveats around those stats depending on where you live, but I can see a lot of Australians this morning untangling what these tax cuts actually mean for them and, them kind of scratching their head going, thanks, Jim, I guess. And look, that's a train the coalition hopped on nice and early last night. The Shadow Treasurer coming out to call it a tax hoax, among other things.
Can I say this is a budget for the next 5 weeks, not for the next 5 years and beyond? And what was offered was a bribe, an election bribe of 70 cents a day, starting in a year's time. And frankly, this is not even going to touch the sides of the economic pain that Australian households have felt over the last 2.5 years since Labor's been empowered.
Which, honestly, Tara, is a really, really fair point. I mean, where the Australian public is hurting is in those day-to-day costs that this just isn't addressing right now. It's going to be a year until we see something coming through, and that something is very, very small. Interestingly, the Shadow Treasurer said the coalition does not back this tax cut proposal, which is interesting, and it's a little departure from this bipartisanship that we've been seeing in the last few weeks. Whether or not the coalition is going to come out with their own tax reform and tax proposals, that's yet to be seen. Of course, that all hinges on what we're going to hear on Thursday when Peter Dutton comes out with his budget reply.
And the coalition's not alone in their criticism of the tax cuts. Greens leader Adam Band called it a tiny tax tweak, while key voices in the social service and welfare sector have also been critical, noting that the cuts only apply if you earn more than $45,000 a year. And some of those groups are labelling it an election budget that gives money back to everyone except those with the least, and doing very little to lift people on the bottom line out of poverty.
Yeah, and the Treasurer was quick to point out that these cuts, when combined with last year's cuts, that's why he keeps on calling it a top-up cut, he reckons we'll see savings of $50, not $5 a week, which is much more palatable and sellable. And to his credit, he said that these cuts will pack more of a punch when joined with a raft of other cost of living measures, most of which have already been announced.
We knew the cost of living was always going to be central to this budget, and some of it we have covered, but the main takeaways are basically we're going to see cheaper medications and doctor's visits. We know that the price of 4 out of 5 PBS meds are meant to be going down so that they're not going to be more than $25. Now, that's the cheapest they've been in decades, so that's great news. Then our GP visits, the government's tripling bulk billing incentives, so $8.5 billion is being spent on that, and the goal basically is to have 9 out of 10 GP visits fully bulk billed by the end of the decade. A long time to wait, but very happy news for many. I'm definitely a fan of that one. Then there's a big Medicare injection so that the threshold is being increased for low-income singles, families, seniors and pensioners. Then moving on to our power bills, which we've talked about a lot this week. We know that there's going to be an extension on our energy bill rebates. That'll be $150 off our quarterly bills for every household and a lot of small businesses. And then we've got some news for parents as well. There'll be $5 billion going toward improving childcare availability across the country, and about $1 billion of that is being spent building 160 new centres. Parents will also get 3 days of their kids' childcare subsidised from next year, which will impact about 66,700 families next year. So that's a pretty big one as well.
And it's no doubt that this is all part of the Albanese government's kind of, pitch to middle Australia. We saw that work in the US. It is where the most need is needed, right now. So it's not shocking that we're seeing it happening here. And that brings us to our second surprise announcement of last night, and that was a ban on non-compete clauses for around 1 in 5 Australian workers. So those are the conditions in your employment contract that stop or restrict you from moving to a competitor or starting your own rival business once you've left your current or old job. The Treasurer last night having this to say.
Non-competes are holding too many Australians back from switching to better, higher-paying jobs. More than 3 million Australians are captured by these clauses, including childcare workers, construction workers and hairdressers. People shouldn't need to hire a lawyer to take the next step in their career, or permission from their old boss if they want to be their own boss and turn an idea into a small business.
Yeah, and that language, Tara, the hairdressers, the construction workers, the childcare workers, that was something that was front and centre during his 30-minute speeches, as well as the media blitz, quote unquote, that he did afterwards. As to why this is important, he says it'll help create more competition in a way that will lift productivity and reduce inflation, and also bring about, which is the big one here for us, a 4% boost in wages. Big picture, and according, yeah, legit, that is good. This is good news.
See this.
Yeah. Big picture, according to the Productivity Commission, is that it could improve our GDP by $5 billion. A caveat, it looks like this will only apply to those earning up to $180,000 a year.
And other than the high income earners, some of the people who might not exactly be thrilled by this one is businesses who operate in kind of those like tight-knit industries where everyone knows everyone, like us in the media, and also organisations where there's some kind of concern about, confidentiality and sensitive information being shared maybe with competitors. There's obvious incentives in that they now can more easily poach competitor employees but can no longer restrict where theirs go. Now, on the topic of businesses, let's quickly talk small business. We found out last night that the government won't be extending the instant asset write-off scheme. That's where businesses that turn over less than $10 million a year can immediately deduct the cost of an asset up to $20,000 rather than have that depreciate over time. Now, industry lobby groups have called on the government to correct this, saying around 1 million small businesses have benefited from this scheme, and it's acted as a popular incentive for operators in recent years to buy things like cars and equipment. I'm thinking of people like tradies here.
Of course, we can't talk budget without touching on housing. Unfortunately, there wasn't any major news for renters or first home buyers in last night's budget, especially anyone hoping to buy a home in what's a really, really difficult housing market right now. Some of the good tidbits though, there'll be an $800 million extension to the government's Help to Buy scheme, which gives first home buyers a chance to own their property, but with smaller mortgages and lower deposits. So essentially, this is where a home buyer goes in with the government to buy their property. The government can own up to 30 to 40% of that, and then the buyer buys it back over time. The expansion will see the caps on the value of a home and buyer's income increased, and the government says this should help about 40,000 Aussies enter the housing market. Yes, okay, 40,000 is a big-ish group, but it's not a catch-all moment.
No, and there were some other measures that have been announced to try and free up some properties in the market and kind of help this situation. We know that foreign buyers are being banned from buying existing homes for the next 2 years as of next month, April 1st. And then meantime, there'll be a massive chunk of the budget that's going to be spent on building an extra 1.2 million new homes in the next 5 years. That'll cost $33 billion. There's also money being spent to give incentives for the various state and territories to try and lift up their construction rates on modular homes. Now, in terms of social and affordable housing, we can expect 18,000 more to be built in the next decade. So something there for the bottom line.
Yeah, and that'll all be supported by a newly announced streamlined process in this budget, which is aiming to cut red tape and minimise delays in one part of the construction industry. So electricians, this is for you. An electrician would only need just one license now to work across Australia rather than having one for each state or territory that they're working in. And that's really great for those living on any borders or those, tradies travel up and down, at least those in Sydney that I know, they travel up and down the coast all the time to and from Queensland and Victoria. So didn't know that this was an issue, but I can see how this would be massive moving forward. At the moment, it doesn't extend to all trades, so this national scheme does not extend to all trades, but it's definitely a space to watch.
Tonight we are proud to make the single biggest commitment to Medicare since its creation. A record $8.5 billion to lift bulk billing rates and build our health workforce.
So a big announcement there around Medicare, and we did hear a little bit earlier already on that, and the GPs, bulk billing and PBS meds. When it comes to Medicare specifically, we know there's also going to be 50 new Medicare urgent care clinics created nationally, and Jim Chalmers says the goal is basically that 4 in 5 Aussies would be within 20 minutes of one of these clinics. For women in health, there'll be $573 million going towards boosting women's health services, and that'll be things like new endometriosis and pelvic pain clinics, and there'll also be a Medicare rebate for women who are trying to pay for menopause health assessments as well.
Yeah, and more broadly, there's also funding for hundreds of nursing scholarships and 2,000 GP trainees. Aged care workers will see their wages go up, and we'll see $1.7 billion going towards our public hospitals. Some of that is meant to focus on reducing those really lengthy hospital wait times, which we know has been a big issue in many areas and many states across this country. And an interesting one relating to mental health, a medication that will be included on the PBS is ketamine. $1.8 billion is being spent over the next 5 years towards including it. It's a nasal ketamine spray to help with treatment-resistant mental health issues.
Yeah, that one's interesting, but it's actually, I think that'll be really good news for quite a lot of people. I remember interviewing a man named Alan once who had one of the most treatment-resistant forms of depression that some of the unis that were studying it had seen. And the Black Dog Institute had managed to find this one form of ketamine treatment that actually worked on him for the first time in decades.
Wow.
And it wasn't this nasal spray specifically, but that's where this began. So he had said one of the biggest barriers and the biggest issues with that medication was the price. It was really, really astronomical price. So to see these types of ecstasy medications for depression, anxiety and those types of illnesses included in the PBS, I think that'll be really good news for many people.
Now, returning to our budget coverage, let's take a quick look at education. We know one of the big announcements in this area is public schools getting fully funded by 2034. Billions is being spent on that. Queensland was the last state to put pen to paper on that deal last week. This is also an area that the coalition has backed dollar for dollar, so we know that this will happen. It won't hinge on whether Labor is re-elected. To my earlier point about this spirit of bipartisanship, this is another area where we're seeing that happen. And you know what? Rightfully so. This is a great one.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another really good one, besides that, 19 billion being slashed in debt for more than 3 million Aussies.
Woo!
So woohoo, we'll see 16 billion spent wiping about 20% of students' HECS and HELP debts. That is a win. I am on that list. There'll also be free TAFE, so 100,000 free placements across the country. Now, I mentioned just before, I think the HECS HELP debt, we've heard a little bit about that in the news this year. I have been paying mine off since I left uni, and yet if you looked at my HECS debt, it would not tell you so, because the indexation that has been added to it essentially counteracts every payment I've made, and I know that's the same for a number of people that are students right now or ex-students. And so I think anything around debt and wiping student debt will be warmly welcomed.
Yeah, hear, as they've been, as we heard the politicians saying all night last night. Yes, and if you do want to know more about how this HECS debt slashing works and whether it'll benefit you, I will link my deep dive from last year in the show notes.
Now, Chris, you mentioned at the top of the show that there's an illegal industry that's burnt a little bit of a hole in this year's budget. What can you tell us about that one?
So it is ciggies, Tara. It is illegal darts, a lucrative, very lucrative black market that's wiped almost $7 billion from the budget in the form of uncollected tax. So we know the government is fighting this war with illegal tobacco. It's nothing new, but what is kind of new are these figures, and that we know for sure that they are losing this war. The budget is also providing a further $156 million to boost enforcement efforts in this space. So essentially what the cause of all of this is the origins of the tax on every single pack of cigarettes. So they've been a very lucrative source of revenue for the government for a very long time, initially introduced to deter people from smoking by really jacking up the prices of a pack of ciggies. So we know that legal cigarettes cost about $50 a packet, while illegal cigarettes, Tara, and not from personal purchase experience or history, they can cost as little as $15. Now, I'm not going to continue outing myself here, but there were some other fines in this year's budget that's got us at the very least talking last night and a little bit this morning. Hit us with some of our quirky and, funner finds.
And there were a few, actually, some really random ones, left field, but one that will impact quite a lot of people, our booze or beer lovers out there, or people that work in the industries, brewers per se. The draft beer excise indexation will be paused for 2 years. That's been something that's drawn a lot of complaint from the beer industry. And there's also some tax relief for Australian wine producers and distillers. Now, this is good news because often what will happen is if they are taxed higher amounts, often that cost is passed on to us, the purchasers, the beer and wine and gin drinkers.
Yes.
So anything that kind of cuts down their pricing is likely to also impact the amount we pay for a beer at the pub. So that's good news.
And the good news continues, Tara Cassidy, but with animals, specifically pandas.
Yeah, this one was just really interesting. One line that I read about, there are 2 pandas in Adelaide Zoo who have got a decent chunk of funding in this year's budget. $7.6 million is going to be spent on these pandas over the next decade. And I think we did a bit of a deep dive on that already, didn't we, Chris?
Yeah, last year. And Sasha Varvagat loves talking about the pandas, and it's part of this soft diplomacy efforts with China. So really interesting to see how global tensions are kind of ramping up with China, and so is our efforts to keep them as a really close partner. And speaking of partnerships, Tara, you uncovered a little niche one this year as well.
This one is a little bit left field, definitely something we haven't seen before, a random budget inclusion, but not so much what was on the paper, but who was in the lockup with other media and journalists to report on the budget. Influencers. Yeah. There was a bunch of influencers that were apparently invited to join the media in lockup this year. There was a number of them that were photographing themselves outside before heading into lockup, and apparently that is to try and reach younger voters. More and more people we know are consuming their news online, social media, podcasts, and so they are hoping that the coverage will reach those audiences, and obviously ahead of a very soon upcoming election.
Yeah. And I mean, just to be clear, it wasn't like influencers in the way of, you know, the ones that do the little TikTok dances on the street. No one was, you know, while the budget was being handed down doing a little count of 8. It was influencers like Hannah Ferguson from Cheek Media, who we've had on this podcast a handful of times. So I wouldn't even describe her as an influencer. I'd describe Hannah more as in that journalism opinion space as opposed to a stock standard influencer. But it was very... Content creator, yeah. It was very, very interesting, though, to see them changing tact this year. And like you said, a great way and clever way, as we learnt from the US election, to reach those younger voters.
Yeah, it might be new here, but it's not entirely a new concept. Like you mentioned, it has apparently been seen in the US. The Democratic Party had a room of content creators at one of their conventions last year. So taking a leaf out of the US book again.
Yeah, which, like I say time and time again, is equal parts exciting and terrifying. Tara, that brings our budget wrap to a close. Hey, well done, our first budget wrap together. And don't forget, like every other day, we still have the afternoon edition of The Briefing with Tash Belling coming out from 4 p.m. this afternoon. But with all that said, I'm Chris Spyrou.
I'm Tara Cassidy.
And this has been The Briefing.
Listener.